The space between reaction and response. A reaction feels immediate. Something happens, and before you can think, you are already inside it. The tone changes. The body tightens. The impulse appears. And from the inside, it seems instantaneous, as if there were no space at all between what happened and what followed. But that feeling is misleading. The reaction is fast. Very fast. But fast is not the same as immediate. There is a moment before the reaction fully takes over. Small, brief, usually unnoticed. A moment when the impulse has appeared, but has not yet become action. Most people never notice it. Not because it is absent, but because speed hides it. The system moves quickly, and attention arrives late. So the reaction feels complete by the time it is noticed. You do not see the beginning. You only notice that you are already inside it. Inside the irritation, inside the fear, inside the contraction, inside the urge to speak, to pull away, to defend, to close. This creates the illusion that reaction is inevitable, that there was never another possibility. But inevitability is often just unobserved speed. Something begins in the body before it becomes behavior, a shift in tension, a narrowing of focus, a movement toward action. That movement is the important part, because that movement is not yet the full reaction. It is the beginning of one. And beginnings are different from outcomes. A beginning can still be noticed. A beginning can still be felt. A beginning can still remain incomplete. This is not about control. The moment before reaction is not a place of mastery. It is a place of perception, a finer perception than most people are used to. Usually, attention is trained on what happens after. What was said, what was done, what it meant. This asks for something else. Not the result, the formation, not the behavior. The moment it starts gathering force. This is much harder to see, because once the reaction completes, it becomes obvious. You know you were angry. You know you were defensive. You know you pulled away. But the moment before that, when the reaction was still becoming, is much quieter. It does not announce itself. It is a small shift, a sense of readiness, a preparation, an inner leaning. The body begins to organize itself around a response. And if that organization is noticed, something becomes visible that is usually missed. The reaction is not one single event. It is a process. It begins. It gathers. It becomes. And because it is a process, it can be observed before it fully takes shape. At first, this sounds abstract, but it is not abstract. You can see it in very ordinary moments. A message appears, and before any thought is clear, something in the body changes. A face shifts expression, and before language forms, attention tightens. A memory returns, and before emotion is named, an old movement begins. These are small things, but they reveal something essential. Reactions do not arrive as complete structures. They build themselves. And when that building is noticed, the mind is no longer watching only the outcome. It is watching the construction. That changes everything, because once construction is visible, reaction no longer feels like a wall. It feels like movement. And movement can be sensed more precisely than a finished state. Not to stop the reaction, not to improve it, not to replace it, only to notice the instant when impulse begins to organize itself before it becomes response. Once this becomes visible, the relationship with reaction begins to change, not because reaction disappears, but because it is no longer experienced only at its endpoint. Most people notice reaction when it is already strong, when the voice is changed, when the body is tense, when the action is already moving. At that stage, everything feels decided. The system has momentum. The reaction feels justified. The body feels committed to it. But when the earlier moment is noticed, something becomes clearer. What felt like one solid event is seen as stages, an activation, a gathering, a leaning, a movement toward expression. And that sequence matters, because once a sequence is visible, the reaction no longer feels like a single block of inevitability. It feels constructed, and anything constructed can be perceived more finely than something imagined to be instant. This does not mean the impulse becomes weak. In fact, the impulse may still feel strong. The difference is that strength is no longer confused with completion. Something can be strong and still unfinished. That is an important discovery, because people often believe that once an impulse is felt, the outcome is already decided. But the body is full of unfinished movements. A tightening that does not become speech, a surge that does not become action, an urge that does not become behavior. These are not acts of suppression. They are moments in which the process is still unfolding. And if they are noticed, the system begins to reveal how response is formed. This is where the experiment deepens. Instead of asking, "What did I do?" or "Why did I react like that?" attention moves closer to a quieter question. What started just before that? Not the story, not the justification, not the explanation afterward. The first shift, the first pull, the first sign that the body was organizing itself around a familiar response. That first sign is often extremely small. A slight contraction in the chest, a narrowing behind the eyes, a change in breathing, a forward pressure in the body. Nothing dramatic. And precisely for that reason, it is usually missed. The mind is waiting for something obvious. But this moment is not obvious. It is subtle, because it happens before the reaction becomes visible. And yet, this subtle stage contains more truth than the reaction itself, because once the reaction becomes visible, it is already shaped by momentum. At the beginning, the movement is cleaner, closer to its source, closer to its first organization, closer to the point where the system has not yet become fully committed. This does not create control. It creates intimacy, an intimacy with process. You are no longer only dealing with the outer expression of reaction. You are meeting its inner formation. And meeting formation is very different from managing outcomes. Outcomes are loud. Formation is quiet. Outcomes are social. Formation is private. Outcomes can be explained. Formation can only be noticed. This is why the space between reaction and response is so easy to overlook. It does not present itself as a dramatic opportunity. It appears as a small increase in pressure, a brief inner arrangement, a sense that something is about to move. And when that is felt directly, something softens, not because the reaction is gone, but because you are no longer meeting it for the first time at its strongest point. You are meeting it earlier, closer to its origin, closer to the instant where it is still movement, not identity. This matters because identity attaches late. First there is activation, then there is momentum. Then, almost immediately, the mind says, "This is me. This is how I feel. This is what I have to do." But those statements arrive after the process has already begun. The earlier moment contains none of that language. Only organization, only readiness, only movement. And because there is no story yet, there is also less psychological weight. The system is active, but it is not yet narrated. This is why the space before response can feel strangely neutral, even when the impulse itself is strong. There is energy there, but not yet conclusion. And where there is no conclusion, there is still openness. Not openness as a technique, openness as a fact. The process is still becoming. The gap is not important because it gives you power. It is important because it reveals process. And once process is visible, reaction is no longer experienced as a mysterious force that simply takes over. It is seen as something that builds, something that gathers shape, something that can be felt while it is still forming. That perception changes the quality of attention itself. Attention becomes finer, less dramatic, less fascinated by outcomes. It becomes interested in how things begin. And when attention learns to recognize beginnings, the mind becomes less hypnotized by endings. This is not the end of reaction. It is the end of the illusion that reaction is instantaneous. You begin to see that what once felt immediate was only fast. And in that difference, something essential appears. Not control, not mastery, just a clearer encounter with the living mechanics of response. This is inner cognition.